Day 597 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 285,000 military personnel losses, which represents an addition of 1,030 in the past 24 hours. Once again, hitting that 1k per day mark. Truly monumental figures, which of course, figures like these are always consistent with any ongoing large-scale military engagements we've seen past and present. Then as for hardware losses, so 26 tanks, 49 APVs, and 44 artillery, which is quite consistent with yesterday's 42 tanks, 44 APVs, and 32 artillery. So we're dealing with such big numbers now, and yet many of which are no longer the record-holding numbers or figures here, which is just fascinating given the absolutely monumental numbers that we're seeing on a daily basis now. Oh, and hey, a quick shout out to October 11th, and its mind-blowingly whopping 91 APV losses. That, of course, being a record. It's just leaving me speechless. And so we'll head across to the map now and illuminate the reasons for these considerably constant and high loss numbers. As starting out back in Avdiivka today, so we'll zoom in right there. As Russian forces continued their attempts to advance into the region, which of course is a very heavily fortified and dug in region for the Ukrainian defense forces. And for example, here we see burning Russian equipment in the vicinity of Avdiivka as border guards are, as part of the Ukrainian defense, are actively repelling these Russian attacks. Also, Russian forces tried to actively advance at Pervomianska and Severna, but had no such success. Then on to the northern flank, as the situation is more difficult, with periodically the enemy reaching the railway. And we may need to zoom in for that one. And there it is. So hanging along there, but not being allowed to gain a foothold. But I think what should really be noted here right now is the way that Russia does things, okay? So Russia has continued to utilize barrier troops in this very region, which means they will not allow their first liners to abandon positions or fall back. Because, take for instance, specifically it was noted after getting shelled, a group of 40 men in the Stormzy Penal Battalion, that's right, the Penal Battalion, started to flee. As such, a Russian BMP arrived and started firing at them to return to the battlefield. And we know about this from Russia's very own sources as well. But again, we're frankly not surprised to hear any of this anymore, as it's happened quite a lot in the recent past. And interesting fact that you probably can already guess, but the Soviets used this barrier troops tactic back in World War II to prevent these types of unauthorized withdrawals and desertions. Not to mention also doing it in World War I and the Russian Civil War. So basically 100 years of low Russian soldier morale. I guess some things never change. And back to the map, because Avdiivka is not the only sector where Russians are losing a lot of gear. As just a bit north of here, Ukraine impressively expanded the frontline grey zone, which went east beyond the railway tracks at Avdiivka and Klishchivka. And we'll pop that on the date map just to give you a very good visual, so quite the expansion there indeed. Now, it wasn't just that, but the Ukrainian forces are really having some well-organized artillery fire onto Russian positions in the rear, on the main road travel routes that lead to Bakhmut and Donetsk on the other side, that being the Donetsk city in the south. But again, it wasn't just losses here for the Russian forces in the last day, as if we move up a bit to the Lerman-Crimea line. So as you can see here, these are stills from a video that show no less than 15 knocked out Russian tanks, including 3 of their very best. Their very best. So I'm talking not just the T-90s, but the T-90M variants. So it's just been all round quite the disaster for the Russian army in the Donbass region. But the biggest area of attrition for the Russian forces was certainly back in the Avdiivka area there in the past few days. For instance, with Russian attack columns acting like sitting ducks and really having to contend with landmines from deeply entrenched Ukrainian positions. We're talking 2014 levels of that deeply entrenched. Which is all very reminiscent of Vuhledar from the beginning of the year, where Russian forces performed wave after wave of decently sized armored attack sizes, sending off the assault groups to the actual Ukrainian held position. And to simplify that one, it was roughly 30 days of attacks from the 1st of January to the very last day of the month, with Russia making no progress whatsoever over this space, over a solid month. But in the end, Russia's actions here, particularly near the front lines on the east here, are all very much appearing to be a sign of one of their last major pushes in the Donbass, because of all the wet and muddy Rasputitsa season arriving soon, where they'll have to accept that the lines drawn on the map, wherever they are at the time, in the upcoming month or two, will effectively be set in stone and therefore be putting on display Russia's successes or embarrassing lack thereof for the remainder of the winter season. Now, probably even less than a month or two, because it's going to get wet and muddy, and no army force can really perform a successful offensive that well in those sorts of conditions. Now, moving on, wait a moment, I really should have saved this next part for the funny or the hardware news section, but take a look at these quote-unquote upgraded Russian MTLB armored personnel fighting vehicles, and just the monstrosities that they are. Clearly designed for a bit of extra room expansion on the inside, but done so very poorly with what really appears to look like some really flimsy metal sheeting tacked on. Any small caliber could surely get through that. And in this instance, both of which, in fact, ran over mines, damaged and abandoned. Then, extremely briefly, we'll move across to the southern front today, as on the flanks of Robotina, there is good progress towards Kapani. The AFU has entered the trench networks and kicked out Russians from their most forward defensive positions. And we don't see much in any of this map as yet, but would certainly expect some visual updates on this front shortly. Except for this very small protrusion. I'm quite sure that's new. Yeah, there we go, right there. Then we'll head across to somewhere in the Black Sea, presumably close to Sevastopol, as the Pavel Derzhavin, a Russian naval corvette, was damaged by an explosion near Crimea. Now, the cause remains unclear. Some believe it was struck by a sea mine, but others suspect a Ukrainian strike. In any case, it was a big enough concern for Russian transport in Sevastopol to, in fact, be halted. Now, this ship, built in annexed Crimea, joined the Black Sea Fleet just last year in 2022. And if seriously damaged, this will be problematic for Russia, as their lack of dry dock space would certainly delay any required repairs. You may remember recently some of the dry docks in Sevastopol were seemingly obliterated around the same time as the hit on the Russian Black Sea Fleet HQ, when the Russian submarine was hit. Then on the map, a little bit outside of Russia and Ukraine, so another Russian drone crossed into Romania after targeting the Ukrainian city of Izmail. Now, the drone struck near to the city or town on the other side, Pluru, leaving a crater in its wake. Investigations are underway, but we know what it is. But never forget, Romania does indeed enjoy the protections of NATO Article 5. Then moving across to some news for today, so Zelensky revealed yesterday that the primary focus for Ukraine is on enhancing domestic arms production and implementing extensive digitalization measures for weapon inventory management. So, Zelensky emphasized that digitalization will offer a transparent view of the supply of equipment to Ukrainian soldiers, pinpointing any shortages and outlining strategies to address them. So, it will be like Amazon packages and logistics, but for the military. Insane levels of efficiency. And so, as the old saying goes, infantry wins battles, but logistics wins wars. Then, in some other hardware news, so as for military aid to Ukraine, Lithuania's new aid package will see them send 2 NASAMS air defense systems, which is incredible aid in its own right, and an undisclosed amount of NATO standard 155mm artillery shells. Also, the Czech Republic, aka Czechia, and Denmark announced that they will be jointly donating 50 infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, various light weaponry, electronic warfare and surveillance equipment, and artillery shells. And this is said to be just step one of their new joint venture. Then, as for some other hardware news, and not to be left out, the US announced an upcoming $200 million military aid package for Ukraine, which includes HIMARS ammunition, anti-tank missiles, AIM-9 anti-air missiles, they are the air-to-air launched ones, 155mm artillery shells, also 105mm artillery shells, the AT-4 anti-tank weapons, anti-drone equipment, precision artillery munitions, the list goes on here. But those precision artillery munitions, which likely means the Excalibur, which is much like your standard artillery shell, but with a little bit more range and can be coded in to have a very specific destination in mind. Then in some other news, the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, Executive Board has suspended the Russian Olympic Committee with immediate effect. Now, the IOC stated that Russia's attempt to include, as part of its members, the sports organizations of the now Russian-occupied regions, including Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, is completely against IOC Charter, which means they are out of the Paris 2024 Olympics, possibly also the 2026 winter ones as well, it seems. So it's kind of like if the USA used its military strength to, say, annex Australia, thereby soaking up all the Aussie medal wins in the Olympics to gain an advantage. Obviously a big no-no. And those two countries are a pretty good example to use, as collectively it would cause the USA to absolutely smoke the competition. Then, in some other news, the Estonian government approves a pivotal draft law that, if passed, will cause frozen Russian assets in the country to be transferred to Ukraine. The Estonian PM, Kaja Kallas, declared, quote, "Russia must compensate Ukraine for all the war damages caused." Now, with this event, Estonia aims to lead and to be an example to encourage for similar regulations worldwide. And do note, the amount of Russian assets frozen worldwide varies between sources. However, it is, roughly speaking, to the tune of about 1 to 1.5 trillion US dollars in value. Just staggering. Then in some other news, Russia needs to control the information space even more by looking to ban all VPN access in the country, all in the attempt to largely stop their population from getting an outside view of things. But, and here's the thing, a big but, VPN banning will just embolden citizens to use them even more and to seek out alternative access to these sorts of services. There is always a way. It's just difficult to implement. And just by trying it can really backfire on Russia, causing civilians to have an increased distrust for their own government. So these are some very short-sighted Russian political positions. For instance, at the top levels of Russian government, Putin would think, hey, that's a great idea, let's lock down the information space even more, banning the VPNs, all of them where we can. But on the reverse end of the scale, regular Russians will only feel even more that the Russian government is only trying to hide things from them. Then in some more news, and I'm not really sure where to put this news piece, let's call it a pre-funny if you will, but here it is, because in this video you see a very unhealthy and sweaty looking Kadyrov, Chechen leader Kadyrov, as he applies the pressure on a 15-year-old, who was actually the victim of assault from one of his sons, and it's just a great example of the Russian mafia state, especially how they feel the need to televise the bullying of a 15-year-old boy. Just disgraceful. But hey, I'm sure that Kadyrov feels like a big man right now. Then, as for a funny to round it all off with today, guys, so also relating to Kadyrov, as he accused one of Russia's greatest heroes, Joseph Stalin, of being a traitor. No kidding, as he said in this address to the audience as part of the 205th birthday celebrations of the Chechen city of Grozny, that the traitor was Stalin. He evicted not only the Chechen people, but other different people too. So, just wow. I mean, the gloves are off for this guy, who is clearly continuing to not look well at all. Very unhealthy. And maybe that's why the gloves are off. We know that he's unwell. What is it? Kidney damage? Something along those lines. But even before his health issues may get to him, perhaps he'll still be given the option between a window or tea with remarks of this magnitude. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, hit the like button, check out my other channel in the comments section below, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.